Two newlyweds vanished without a trace in the desert. No one knew they had been lured into a trap disguised as a roadside motel. Behind the fake name Richard Banks was a disgraced ex-soldier who turned the ruins of the Desert Wind Inn into a hunting ground for passing couples. But everything changed when, 4 years later, a rusted suitcase suddenly appeared in a field that was never supposed to be disturbed. And just wait until you see how this haunting mystery finally unraveled, and why justice, at last, had the final word. In early June of 2019, Mark and Elena Ruiz packed their bags and locked the door to their small apartment in Austin, Texas, for what was meant to be the start of something beautiful, their honeymoon. They had been married just 9 days. Still glowing from the wedding, the young couple smiled their way out of the city in a rented white Jeep Liberty, their eyes set on the open roads of the American Southwest. Mark, a 29-year-old high school history teacher, had always been fascinated by stories of frontier towns, sun-bleached landscapes, and the haunting silence of forgotten places. The Wild West, to him, wasn't just myth, it was sacred ground. Elena, 27, worked as a nurse at a local pediatric clinic, known by friends as a quiet soul with a sharp artistic eye. Since childhood, she had carried cameras like other kids carried dolls. She dreamed of this trip for years, not the luxury of a 5-star resort, but the thrill of discovering something raw and untouched. Her plan was to photograph every dusty diner, every lonely road, every strange, wonderful face they'd meet along the way. They mapped out a route through New Mexico and Arizona, giving themselves 2 weeks. It was supposed to be unstructured, unscripted, and unforgettable. For several days, it was. Their social media told the story of a couple wrapped in joy. Pictures of them sipping iced tea in roadside cafes, standing barefoot at the edge of white sands, laughing as they tried to pitch a tent against the wind. Elena posted regularly, her captions often sweet and simple. Us chasing the sun. Mark pretending he's in a Western. Never going home. Each photo added to the sense of a journey unfolding just the way they had hoped, free, full of love, and far away from everything. But then, suddenly, everything stopped. On June 9th, Elena posted what would become their final image, a shot of an abandoned gas station on Route 55 in southern New Mexico. The station was weather-beaten, its sign half swallowed by rust. The sky was bruised with storm clouds. In the foreground, the Jeep was parked slightly off-kilter on cracked pavement. No one else was around. The caption read, "Middle of nowhere. Perfect." That photo would be the last anyone saw or heard from either of them. Calls from parents went unanswered. Texts from friends remained marked as delivered but unread. There were no more posts, no activity on credit cards or bank accounts. When the Jeep wasn't returned to the rental company and no one had seen the couple at any motel past that date, a missing persons report was filed. Search efforts began, but with no clear destination and nothing but desert in every direction, the case hit a wall. The Jeep was never recovered. Neither were Mark and Elena. It was as if they had evaporated into the desert air. 11 days after the last post, on June 20th, they were officially declared missing. The families were devastated. The story quietly circulated in local press, but there were no major breakthroughs, no sightings, no evidence. For 4 years, the file sat cold. Then, in July of 2023, everything changed. A rancher plowing a forgotten patch of land on the outskirts of Lincoln County struck something unusual beneath the surface. What he uncovered wouldn't just reopen the case, it would shatter the belief that this was simply a tragic accident or a case of getting lost. It was something much stranger, something no one could explain. And just like that, the desert gave back a piece of its silence. It was a dry morning in July 2023 when Lewis Harrison climbed into his old red tractor and rumbled toward the back of his 400-acre ranch in Lincoln County. At 64, Lewis had spent most of his life working this land, but this corner of the property, an overgrown stretch of dusty pasture behind the ridgeline, hadn't been touched in nearly 2 decades. The soil was hard, clumped, and brittle from years of drought. He had finally decided to reclaim it, perhaps plant alfalfa again next spring. The day was quiet, the kind of quiet only the desert can hold. just the whirring of the engine and the slow, rhythmic creak of metal over dry earth. Then, without warning, the tractor jolted hard to the left. Lewis slammed the brakes and felt the machine lurch under him. For a second, he thought he'd hit a buried boulder. He climbed down, brushed off his gloves, and walked around to inspect. Wedged beneath the plow blade was something unmistakably man-made, a jagged edge of metal jutting through the soil. Frowning, Louis dropped to one knee and began digging with his hands. Within minutes, he had unearthed the box. Not just any box, a suitcase. It was heavy, rust-stained, and sealed tight with a thick padlock. The corners were rounded, old-fashioned, and the handle was coated in a film of dust that, curiously, didn't match the soil around it. Louis leaned in closer. The surface of the suitcase was scratched but intact. There were no signs of long-term exposure, no rot, no insect damage. It hadn't been underground long. And yet, there was no one for miles, no tire tracks, no footprints, just sun, wind, and silence. He stood up slowly, his boots crunching the dry dirt beneath him, and did the only thing that made sense. He called the sheriff's office. When deputies arrived later that afternoon, the suitcase sat exactly where he'd left it, half buried, still locked. A young officer named Daniels examined it carefully before retrieving a bolt cutter from the back of his cruiser. Louis watched, arms folded across his chest, as the cutter snapped the lock with a hollow crack. Daniels hesitated, then slowly lifted the lid. Inside were just 3 items. 2 silver wedding rings resting side by side in the corner. The engraving on the inside of each band read the same message: "Forever starts 06.01.19. Next to the rings was a disposable film camera, the kind tourists once carried before phones replaced memories. The film hadn't been removed. And tucked neatly beneath both, an old motel keycard. The logo printed on the plastic was faded, but still legible. Desert Wind Inn, Room 7. Daniels turned the card over. No swipe chip, no barcode, just the name and number. He radioed it in immediately. Within an hour, local records had been searched, along with county and state archives. Then national motel directories. Nothing. There was no such place as the Desert Wind Inn in Lincoln County. No business license, no historical listing, nor archived reviews, no maps or travel brochures. The name didn't exist anywhere official, not in 2019, not before, and not after. It was as if the motel had never existed, or someone had made sure it didn't. Louis said little as the officers photographed and documented everything, but his mind couldn't shake the chill crawling up his spine. He had lived on that land for nearly 40 years. If someone had buried that suitcase on his property, they had done it recently and quietly, too quietly. He looked out across the dry field, wind blowing softly through the dead grass, and asked the question that would soon echo far beyond the boundaries of his ranch. Who would bury a suitcase in the middle of nowhere, and why now, after 4 years of silence? The camera was immediately submitted to the State Forensic Lab in Santa Fe. Given the condition of the film and the significance of what had been found alongside it, analysts worked under tight security and high urgency. For 2 weeks, the camera sat in a humidity-controlled environment as specialists carefully extracted the aged roll of 35mm film, avoiding even the slightest exposure to light. The wait was excruciating, especially for the families of Mark and Elena Ruiz, who had endured years of silence. What the camera held could be nothing, or it could finally be the missing piece of a puzzle that had haunted 2 states for over 4 years. When the film was finally developed, the first few frames appeared innocent, even joyful. Mark and Elena, arm in arm, stood smiling in front of a sweeping view of Coyote Canyon, a popular overlook just off the interstate. The sun painted everything in shades of gold and rust. The couple looked happy, relaxed. In another image, they were seen beside their rented white Jeep on Route 55, Mark leaning against the hood, Elena holding up 2 fingers in a peace sign. Her camera strap was visible on her shoulder. At first glance, the sequence seemed like a typical vacation reel, until the 4th photograph changed everything. In that image, taken at night, stood a wooden building half shrouded in shadow.
The structure was single-story, its exterior boarded with weathered planks, and a single unlit bulb dangled above the entrance. Above the door hung a faded sign, Desert Wind Inn, Room 7. The motel was real, or at least had once been. That image was followed by something much harder to explain. The fifth frame was taken inside what appeared to be a room. The focus was poor, but the contents were unmistakable. A bed with torn sheets, a cracked mirror on the wall, and in the foreground, Elena. Her face was blotched, her eyes red. She sat on the edge of the bed, looking toward the camera, not with a smile, but with tears. The room behind her was dim, almost lifeless, its walls discolored with age and grime. She appeared to be mid-sentence, mouth slightly open, as if speaking or pleading. There was no Mark in sight.
The next few photos were blurred, possibly taken in motion, but certain elements stood out. An overturned chair, a corner of the room's ceiling, a shattered glass on the floor. Then, in one chilling frame, what looked like a man's hand reached toward the lens. The frame was abrupt, as though the camera had been yanked away mid-shot. The hand appeared large, the knuckles pale and defined, but no face was visible. The final frame was a burst of complete blackness, except for a harsh, close-range flash, illuminating only static and noise. It was unclear whether the shot was accidental or deliberate, but there was no mistaking it. The reel had ended violently. Investigators cross-referenced the Desert Wind Inn with every known registry in New Mexico and Arizona. County records, private business filings, historical motel directories, real estate assessments, nothing. No motel by that name had been licensed or listed. No tax records, no Google Street View, no TripAdvisor reviews, no postcards, not even rumors in regional blogs. They widened the search to aerial imaging archives from 2019. Satellite photos were pulled from multiple commercial providers, covering a radius of 50 miles around Route 55. Grid by grid, they examined every structure, every foundation, every crossroad. Yet in that stretch of open land, there was only desert. No roads leading to motels, no signs of buildings resembling the one in the photograph. The coordinates from Elena's phone, the last ping before it went offline, placed them just north of where the suitcase had been discovered. Still, no visual proof of any inn. So the question remained, if the Desert Wind Inn never officially existed, where had the photo been taken? And perhaps even more troubling, who had taken the final images? Who had handled the camera after Elena? And most of all, who, after all this time, had unearthed this piece of the past, just to bury it again? Following the discovery of the suitcase and the haunting images recovered from the camera, investigators returned to Lincoln County with renewed urgency. The evidence was no longer just circumstantial. It hinted at a place, a timeline, and the likelihood that someone had been watching, waiting, or even involved. Detectives canvassed nearby towns and ranches, speaking with anyone who might have been driving or walking the land in June 2019. Days passed with little progress until a name came up during a conversation at a feed store outside Capitan. Roy Baxter, a retired veteran and longtime resident of the area, had lived in a modest trailer on the outskirts of the Canyon Valley since the mid-'80s. When two officers knocked on his door, Roy greeted them cautiously, a mug of coffee in one hand and a faded army ball cap pulled low over his brow. He listened carefully to their questions, then nodded slowly as if accessing a memory long buried beneath everyday routine. "Yeah," he said, "I remember a white Jeep. That was a few years back, maybe early summer. June, bright day, dry heat, same as usual." According to Roy, he had been returning from checking on a well pump when he spotted a vehicle pulling off Route 55 and onto a narrow dirt path that veered south, one that most locals avoided. The path, overgrown and largely forgotten, led toward the canyons but had once been used by service trucks decades ago. It wasn't maintained, not even marked on most maps. "I figured they were just a couple of tourists chasing some view," Roy added. "Didn't think much of it. Folks get curious out here. Some are looking for history, some for quiet. That road don't lead to either anymore." Intrigued by the detail, detectives turned to satellite data archives. Using commercial imaging services and government databases, they began combing through layers of images captured between May and July 2019. Most images showed nothing unusual, just long stretches of sun-scorched wilderness. But then, buried in the grid, something surfaced. There it was, a thread of a path, almost invisible to the untrained eye, etched faintly into the terrain like a scar. Dusty and broken, it wound its way southward from Route 55 and disappeared between two ridgelines. One satellite image dated June 10, 2019, just one day after the last known Instagram post from Elena, showed something new at the end of that trail. A rectangle of flat, unnatural contrast. A slab, possibly concrete, roughly 40 feet long. There were no visible buildings, no activity, just a grayish patch surrounded by sagebrush and sand, nestled within an outcropping of stone. No road connected to it beyond that narrow trail, but the shape was too symmetrical. The find was enough. Law enforcement quickly assembled a ground team with search and rescue personnel, forensic analysts, and desert navigation experts. Within 48 hours, an unmarked convoy rolled out from the county sheriff's office under the weight of expectation and dread. They followed Roy's recollection and the satellite coordinates, navigating miles of barely passable terrain. The deeper they went, the more isolated it became. No cell signal, no power lines, not even remnants of fencing or signage. Just an expanse of dry silence where even the wind seemed to hesitate. And then, 18 miles in, the landscape opened into a shallow basin. And there it was, the slab. A faded, broken rectangle of poured concrete surrounded by brittle weeds and sun-bleached debris. Nature had tried to reclaim it, but geometry doesn't lie. It had been built, and not recently. Cracks spidered along its edges, but the center remained solid. The search team stopped. Engines idled. Nobody spoke. Because everyone knew whatever had once stood here had been hidden for a reason, and they had just unearthed its ghost. When the expedition team arrived at the site, they found themselves standing before what remained of a building that seemed more phantom than structure. From a distance, it blended into the dry earth and faded brush like something the desert had tried to forget. But as the team moved closer, the illusion broke. There, pressed against the concrete slab they had seen from the satellite images, stood the skeletal outline of a small, long-abandoned lodge. The walls, scorched and leaning inward, bore only fragments of their original form. But at the base of the crumbling facade, half obscured by soot and time, the investigators could still make out faint letters in washed-out paint. Desert Wind Inn. The name matched the keycard found in the suitcase. It was real. No longer speculation. No longer a ghost from a photograph. The Desert Wind Inn had existed. Once hidden, now half revealed by time and ash. What remained inside, however, spoke to deliberate ruin. The building had been burned, likely with purpose. Charred wooden beams collapsed in corners, blackened furniture frames twisted like broken ribs, and the air inside still held a faint chemical scent long since baked into the stone. Someone had wanted this place erased. Despite the damage, the team moved methodically, documenting each room, every scorched tile and rusted hinge. In what must have once been the main lobby, now little more than rubble and shadow, they uncovered a partially melted counter, and behind it, what looked like the remains of a metal stove or fireplace. Its flue snapped and crumpled against the ceiling beams. One of the forensic agents crouched beside the stove, brushing away a pile of ash and loose debris. There, wedged beneath a warped tile panel, was something unexpected. A folded piece of paper, preserved inside a thin plastic envelope. It was a shipping invoice. The form was faded but legible. It listed a delivery of general goods, cleaning supplies, canned food, bottled water, linens. The date at the top stopped everyone cold. June 10th, 2019. The exact day Mark and Elena Ruiz had vanished. According to the document, the items were delivered to Desert Wind Inn at 10 Richard L. Banks.
The name struck everyone as unfamiliar. Until that moment, there had been no mention of anyone by that name in the entire Ruiz investigation. No records, no sightings, no known associates. The police had never connected any figure named Richard Banks to the couple, to the route, or to the region. And yet here it was, his name, printed clearly as the recipient of a delivery made the very day two honeymooners were last seen alive. It wasn't coincidence, it was connection. A thread pulled tight between a forgotten building, a mysterious name, and the sudden silence of two lives that had once been full of light. The invoice included no return address. The vendor, a small logistics company that had since gone out of business, had only partial archives available. Still, the document raised urgent questions. Who was Richard L. Banks? What was he doing at this remote location? And why did he receive supplies on the exact date Mark and Elena vanished? Had he run the Desert Wind Inn as some off-grid operation? Or was the inn just a front for something more troubling? And most of all, if this place had been burned down after 2019, who destroyed it? Who and what exactly were they trying to hide? The name Richard L. Banks sent investigators down a trail both unexpected and unsettling. With the delivery invoice in hand and no matching ID in any local or national system, the FBI launched a background trace using commercial databases, historical aliases, and regional employment records.
It didn't take long for the illusion to fracture. Richard L. Banks, as it turned out, did not exist. Not legally, not officially, not in any searchable history prior to 2018. The Social Security number tied to the name belonged to a man who had died decades earlier in Idaho. The mailing address listed on the invoice led to a rusted-out trailer located 10 miles outside the outskirts of Farmington, New Mexico, at the end of a dirt road rarely used by anyone but deer and coyotes. The trailer had long since been declared abandoned, weather-beaten, stripped of utilities, and overtaken by weeds. Still, when agents arrived, the door was secured with a new lock. Someone had been there more recently than expected. A forensic team was deployed, sweeping the interior for fingerprints, fibers, anything that could provide a match. At first glance, the place appeared empty. The walls were bare, the mattress inside crumbling with age. A tipped-over chair and an open cooler with dust-coated plastic bottles sat in the corner. Nothing overtly sinister, just the slow decay of a forgotten space. The team conducted a full sweep, twice. No immediate evidence. No blood, no documents, no weapons. But on the second pass, while checking the kitchen area, a young field agent named Langley paused beside a corroded ventilation grate above the small stove. Something didn't sit right. The bolts looked recently disturbed, and a faint scratch on the wall caught his attention. He retrieved a flashlight, crouched low, and gently pried off the rusted cover with a multi-tool. Tucked just inside the duct was a crumpled bundle, wrapped in thin plastic sheeting and sealed with black tape. Inside the wrapping were two items. The first, a damaged passport. The photo page had been partially burned. The edges curled and discolored, but the name was still legible. Elena Ruiz. Her signature, her photograph, blurred but undeniably hers. The discovery alone was enough to jolt the room into silence. It had been 4 years. Until now, nothing belonging to either of them had ever surfaced, and yet here it was, hidden deliberately, as if someone had tried to destroy it, but hadn't finished the job. The second item inside the bundle was more alarming. A handheld voice recorder, scratched and dust-covered but intact. No brand markings, just a small piece of masking tape across the back with one word in faded ink, play. The device was immediately sealed in an evidence bag and transported to the regional field office for analysis. Batteries were replaced, the tape was rewound carefully. Technicians stood by, prepared for audio degradation, but what played was clear enough to silence everyone in the room. It was a voice, male, strained, hoarse, but unmistakably familiar to those who had followed the case from the beginning. It was Mark Ruiz. And what he said would reframe everything they thought they knew about the disappearance.
The room where the audio was reviewed fell into complete silence the moment the tape began to play. From the first seconds, it was clear. The voice belonged to Mark Ruiz. Tired, strained, and uneven, his words trembled with a desperation that left no one in doubt. This was not a man speaking casually or calmly. He was scared, perhaps injured, and fighting against both time and fear as he recorded his message. The grainy hiss of the recorder crackled in the background, punctuated by occasional static and the muffled sound of distant movement. Then, slowly, his voice began. "We were led there," Mark whispered, each syllable like a gasp. "He said it was a special place, said no one else knew about it, said it was quiet." He paused, and the silence felt heavier than before. "I don't know who he is. I don't know why he picked us, but he's keeping us here. He won't let us leave." The words came slower after that, interrupted by long, uneven breaths, the kind that come from exhaustion or pain. What was most chilling wasn't just what Mark was saying, but how he said it, as if he knew this might be his only chance to leave a trace behind. He wasn't speaking to someone he could see. He was speaking to anyone who might come across that recording, someday, somewhere. He says no one will find us, that we're too far out, that no one cares. But if someone's listening, please, we're south of Route 55, past the canyon. The next few seconds were filled with static. Then, suddenly, a sharp intake of breath. Wait. A loud, muffled thud followed. Then, silence. The room at the FBI field office remained still. No one moved. No one spoke. The analysts exchanged glances as the audio looped back to the start. That short fragment, less than 90 seconds in length, changed the entire nature of the case.
Up to that moment, the disappearance of Mark and Elena Ruiz had lingered in ambiguity. Two young people gone without a trace, with no clear signs of foul play. But this recording destroyed any remaining doubt. It confirmed, in Mark's own voice, that the couple had been misled, held against their will, and likely harmed. The Bureau wasted no time. Within hours of authenticating the recording, they reclassified the case. What had once been a missing persons investigation was now officially designated a federal criminal case, suspected abduction and possible homicide. Regional task forces were alerted, new warrants were issued, agents who had once closed the file now returned with renewed focus. Because Mark had left behind more than just his voice. He had left a location, a clue, south of Route 55, past the canyon. And in that direction, they would search again, not for answers, but for the truth. 1 month after the voice recorder was recovered from the hidden trailer, the FBI intensified its efforts to search the barren desert south of the ruined Desert Wind Inn. Mark Ruiz's final words had offered a direction. We're south of Route 55, past the canyon. For the first time in years, investigators had more than speculation. They had geography. With the help of search and rescue teams, forensic archaeologists, and state-of-the-art drone surveillance, the agency began systematically scanning the land in expanding radiuses. The area, though desolate, was expansive and harsh. Loose rock, dried riverbeds, and scorched brush made navigation difficult. Days passed without success. Then, one morning, a heat signature was picked up by a thermal drone, indicating an unusual cavity beneath the surface. Located 10 miles south of the motel ruins and obscured by layers of wind-blown dust and broken branches, it wasn't immediately recognizable. But after clearing away debris, the search team uncovered what had once been a well. Crumbling stone lined the mouth, and its walls descended deep into darkness. It had long ago been sealed, probably by time, possibly by intention. But its location, so remote and unreachable by accident, raised immediate suspicions. A vertical descent began. Ropes were secured, cameras lowered. What they found at the bottom shifted the case into an entirely new realm. There, beneath layers of caved-in rubble and hardened sediment, partially hidden beneath what looked like remnants of canvas, were bones. Human bones. The discovery froze the team. No one spoke. Each movement was deliberate. The remains were extracted carefully, placed in sterile containers, and flown under secure escort to the New Mexico State Forensic Lab in Albuquerque. Within 72 hours, the lab confirmed what many feared. The bones belonged to Mark Ruiz. It was the first definitive confirmation of his fate since the day he and Elena vanished. A young man, once full of plans and life, had been buried alone at the bottom of a forgotten well, his final message left behind on a recorder hidden in a trailer miles away. For his family, the news was both a wound and a strange kind of closure. Mark's story, however tragic, now had an ending. But that clarity came with a haunting absence. There was no trace of Elena. No secondary remains, no personal effects, no evidence suggesting she had ever been there at all. Search teams combed the surrounding desert, rescanned satellite imagery, dug test trenches, but found nothing. It was as if she had vanished into air. The forensic report deepened the mystery. Based on the decomposition, environmental exposure, and insect activity, or lack thereof, scientists believed that Mark's remains had been protected for a significant amount of time before being exposed to natural conditions. That well, they suggested, had either been sealed or covered in such a way that delayed decay, meaning someone had taken measures to conceal his body and done so deliberately. But what reopened every question was this. If Mark had likely died in 2019, why had the suitcase only been buried in 2023? Because by every measurable factor, soil compression, moisture levels, oxidation on the lock, the suitcase hadn't been in the ground for more than 2 to 3 months before its discovery. The rings were uncorroded, the camera functioned, the motel keycard, though aged, showed no water damage. That suitcase hadn't sat in the earth through 4 summers and winters. It had been placed there intentionally. So who put it there?
Why, after all this time? Investigators turned their attention back to the location of the discovery, an empty corner of Lewis Harrison's ranch, untouched for over a decade. For 15 years, Lewis had never farmed that plot. But in early spring of 2023, facing retirement and encouraged by rising land values, he had filed paperwork to list the property for agricultural redevelopment. His intention was to resell the parcel or lease it to a neighboring rancher. It was the first time in years that the land had drawn public attention. That timing could not be ignored. Whoever buried the suitcase knew the land was about to be cleared. They knew fresh equipment, tractors, plows, maybe even developers were about to disturb soil that had long gone untouched. If anything was hidden there, it would be uncovered. So the suitcase wasn't left behind in panic. It was planted, purposefully, almost like a message. Not 4 years ago when the case went cold, not in 2020 or 2021 when the world looked away, but right before the land was about to change hands. It suggested surveillance. It suggested planning. And more than anything, it suggested that whoever was involved was still out there, watching. Watching the land, watching the case, and perhaps waiting to see what investigators would do next. As the investigation widened, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and identity fraud specialists worked in tandem to trace the alias Richard L. Banks. With no official records tied to the name, agents turned to deeper databases, cross-referencing biometrics, employment records, military discharge files, and sealed internal reports. After weeks of digital combing, a match emerged. Richard L. Banks was not real, but the man behind the name had once been very real. His true identity? William Coulter. William James Coulter had served as a maintenance contractor on a military base in Arizona until his dishonorable discharge in 2012. The reason was quietly buried in internal disciplinary documents, but clear enough when uncovered. Coulter had been implicated in a serious misconduct incident involving intimidation and physical aggression toward a female civilian employee. Though formal charges never reached trial, his military career ended abruptly, and from that point forward, he faded from public life. No tax filings, no address stability, no employment history in verified systems. He had, it seemed, chosen to disappear. but traces of him resurfaced under the radar. Between 2013 and 2015, under the assumed name Banks, Coulter worked security at an isolated roadside property listed only in local tax assessments as a privately owned lodging facility, Desert Wind Inn. No formal franchise, no official booking platform, just a weather-worn building off an unofficial road functioning just enough to remain unregulated. Then, in 2015, the Desert Wind Inn ceased operations. No closure notice, no sale, it simply vanished from tax rolls and aerial imagery, almost as if it had never existed. Investigators now believe that after it shut down, Coulter never left. He remained among the broken walls, living in silence and operating from the shadows. And it's what happened next that led agents to their most disturbing theory. From cross-referenced travel records and witness interviews, it appeared that several traveling couples between 2016 and 2019 had passed through that section of Route 55 and were never seen again. Cases too scattered to connect until now. The suggestion was horrifying in its simplicity. Coulter had been luring visitors to the ruins of the inn, offering lodging, promising quiet, or playing the role of a harmless caretaker. With no official records, no operating license, and no oversight, it was a place where people could vanish without a trace. The desert would bury the rest. But Coulter himself could no longer answer for any of it. According to a certificate found in the Albuquerque General Hospital records, he had died in 2022 of heart failure. The death was uneventful, signed off without questions. No next of kin listed. And yet, just 1 year after his passing, someone buried the suitcase. Which meant one thing clearly: he hadn't worked alone.
Digging deeper, investigators reviewed regional employment logs, visitor logs from nearby supply depots, and Harrison Ranch's hiring records. There, a new name emerged: Dale Coulter, listed as a temporary laborer on Lewis Harrison's ranch for the spring of 2023. Dale had arrived in May, performed a few weeks of pasture prep work, and was scheduled to return in July. But he never did. He vanished. Neighbors recalled seeing him once or twice, quiet, always alone. He drove an old sedan, never attended local events, and gave no indication of where he came from. When agents searched his hiring paperwork, they discovered it was incomplete. No listed emergency contact, no ID copy on file. Just a signed application with a mailing address that led to a vacant trailer south of Bloomfield. Inside, nothing but a mattress and a cooler. It was then that the working theory began to take shape. Dale Coulter was William's nephew, possibly raised on the edge of the same silence and secrecy. After William's death, Dale likely returned to the place he knew his uncle had once called home. Whether he had been involved before or simply discovered what had been hidden, one thing was clear: he knew about the suitcase. And for reasons investigators still don't fully understand, he decided to dig it up and rebury it. Not where it came from, but in a place where it would be found, a place that was just about to be sold. Then, like the others, he vanished. And with him, perhaps, the last living link to what really happened beyond Route 55. The investigation officially closed in November of 2023. After more than 4 years, dozens of field searches, and a trail that spanned 3 counties and countless unanswered questions, the case of Mark and Elena Ruiz reached its final chapter, at least on paper. Mark's remains, found in the old well south of Route 55, had been positively identified. His death, though the full circumstances remained unclear, was ruled a homicide. Elena, though still missing, was declared legally deceased by a federal judge at the request of her family, citing overwhelming circumstantial evidence and the passage of time. There was no trial, no arrest, no courtroom proceedings. The primary suspect, William Coulter, alias Richard L. Banks, had died the year before the suitcase was found. His nephew Dale, the last known person with potential ties to the hidden evidence, had vanished without a trace. Though the FBI continued to leave the case open for further information, the official investigation was archived.
There were no new leads to chase, no more doors to knock on. But for those left behind, especially Elena's family, closure could never be measured in legal terms. It wasn't about arrest for documents. It was about memory and making sure that what happened in the silence of the desert wasn't erased by it. Elena's mother, Mary Ruiz, was the one who insisted on a memorial. Not a gravestone, there was no body to bury, but something real, something permanent. She worked with local officials and the Harrison family, who generously donated the portion of the field where the suitcase had been found. A modest marker was installed on the edge of the pasture. It stood beneath a mesquite tree, overlooking the land that had held the single clue no one was ever supposed to find. The plaque bore their names. In loving memory of Mark and Elena Ruiz. Gone together, not forgotten. June 2019. At the small dedication, attended by family, a few local residents, and members of the original investigative team, Mary stood beside the stone, holding a photograph of her daughter taken just weeks before the honeymoon. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her message was unwavering. "Maybe we'll never know the full story," she said quietly. "Maybe we'll never understand why they were taken. But I know now they didn't disappear. Someone tried to erase them, to bury their names, their love, their life. But they failed, because we remember, and we will not let the world forget." Those words rippled beyond the memorial. They echoed in the quiet determination of the investigators who had refused to abandon the case, in the friends who shared stories of Mark's gentle wit, or Elena's talent for capturing the soul of a moment with just one photograph, and in the strangers across the country who followed the story, haunted not only by what had happened, but by what had almost remained hidden forever. One last piece of evidence arrived just before the case was closed. It had come from a final analysis of the camera film recovered in the suitcase. Though most frames had already been reviewed, one of the images had been too dark to interpret. Analysts at the Federal Forensics Lab enhanced the photo, adjusting levels, boosting contrast, and removing visual noise. What emerged was harrowing. It was a photo of Elena, likely the last one ever taken of her. She was seated on the edge of a bed, facing the camera. Her face was illuminated only by the flash. Her eyes were wide, not with confusion, but with something deeper. Alarm, fear, maybe realization. Behind her, just barely visible in the smudged reflection of a broken mirror on the wall, was the silhouette of a man. His features were obscured by shadow, his posture unnatural, like someone caught mid-step or mid-watch. Etched into the wall beside the mirror, scratched deep into the wood with something sharp, were words. "Only guests check in, none check out." The image was chilling not for what it showed, but for what it confirmed. Elena knew. She understood something was terribly wrong. Whether she took that photo herself in a final act of defiance, or it was taken by someone else in a moment of control, the result was the same. Her eyes had reached through time, through evidence bags and court forms and news cycles, and demanded to be seen. That photo now hangs in the Ruiz family home, printed in black and white, mounted beside a sunlit wedding picture of Mark and Elena on their first day as husband and wife. Two images, two moments in time, one full of hope, the other full of truth. Their story began with joy, with a road trip across the wild, open landscapes of the American Southwest. It was supposed to be a journey of discovery, shared meals, quiet mornings, stars over Arizona. Instead, it became a descent into silence, into secrets, into a forgotten place that had no business ever existing. But in the end, the story did not remain lost. The desert gave something back. Too late to save them, but not too late to speak for them.